I was working the night shift at a boutique hotel in Prague's Old Town when an American guest, maybe mid-40s in a business suit, walked up to my desk around 11 p.m. He'd just come back from dinner and looked genuinely confused. "Hey, so I gotta ask," he said, leaning on the counter. "Who paid for all this renovation work? Like, the castle? The bridge? All the old buildings?" I blinked. "Sorry, what renovation?" "You know, after World War II, when we rebuilt everything." He said it so matter-of-factly, like he was asking about Wi-Fi passwords. The Marshall Plan money. My grandfather always talked about how America rebuilt Europe. So like, did Prague get funding too, or was that just Western Europe? I had to pause. Charles Bridge was built in 1357. Prague Castle dates back to the 9th century. The astronomical clock he'd probably photographed that afternoon? 1410, but he was looking at me with genuine curiosity, waiting for an answer about American Reconstruction funds. "Sir," I said carefully, "Czechoslovakia was under Soviet influence after the war. We didn't receive Marshall Plan aid, and most of these buildings are much older than 1945, he frowned, pulling out his phone. "That can't be right. My history teacher said we rebuilt Europe. Like, all of it." That was my introduction to a very specific type of confusion. The kind where historical facts get compressed into a simple narrative. And suddenly, every cobblestone street becomes an American construction project. I document these patterns full-time, not to mock, but to understand how national myths actually form. If that kind of cultural analysis is your speed, subscribe. Most channels would have stopped at one anecdote. I've got dozens, and I track how they evolve. But that was just Tuesday. Wednesday brought a different flavor entirely. I was grabbing coffee the next morning at a cafe near the castle when I overheard an elderly American couple, maybe late 60s, talking loudly to their tour guide. The woman was pointing at the Gothic architecture, nearly shouting to be heard. "But when did they ADD all this old-looking stuff?" she asked. "Like for tourism?" The guide, a patient local in his 30s, tried to explain these were original medieval structures. The woman shook her head firmly. "No, honey, I mean, when did they make it look old? We do that in Vegas all the time. The Venetian, the Paris Hotel. It's really well done here, though. Super authentic," her husband nodded along. "The attention to detail is incredible. Probably cost a fortune." The guide gave up and just smiled. Sometimes that's the only option. Then there was the guy at the hostel in Krakow. Young backpacker, early 20s, American flag patch on his bag. He was complaining to the front desk girl about the shower pressure, which somehow spiraled into a lecture. "You guys should really modernize this infrastructure," he said. "I mean, we gave you all that money after the war. Where did it actually go?" The receptionist, who couldn't have been older than 19, just stared at him. Poland lost 6 million people in that war. The country was devastated, and he was critiquing shower pressure through the lens of financial aid that never arrived. But that was just the beginning. I was working as a museum guide at the Pergamon Museum in Berlin when I encountered what I now call the American renovation theory. A woman in her 50s, speaking with a thick southern accent, stopped me in front of the Ishtar Gate. "Excuse me, sweetheart," she said, smiling warmly. "I just wanted to say y'all did an amazing job rebuilding all this after we bombed it." "Really? Just beautiful work." I tried to process that sentence. The Ishtar Gate was built in Babylon around 575 BCE. It was excavated and brought to Berlin in the early 1900s. Yes, the museum suffered damage during World War II, but... "Ma'am, this gate is from ancient Mesopotamia," I explained. "It's over 2,500 years old." She patted my arm. "Oh, honey, I know it's styled old. But when was it actually built? Like 1950s? 1960s? The craftsmanship is just incredible." Her husband joined in. "We're from Atlanta. We know good reconstruction when we see it." After Sherman burned everything, we had to rebuild too. This is really impressive, though. The fake aging technique is flawless. I stood there holding my clipboard, trying to figure out where to even start. They genuinely believed the entire museum was a post-war replica, built with American money, designed to look ancient. The concept that these were actual artifacts, millennia old, transported and reassembled, just wouldn't compute. This is the level of field research I bring to every video. Direct encounters, not internet speculation. The subscribers here aren't looking for hot takes. They're looking for primary sources. If you recognize the difference, you're already thinking like an anthropologist. Subscribe for more of this. So who did the construction work? The woman asked. German companies, or did y'all bring in American contractors? I excused myself to help another tour group. Some battles you just can't win. 3 days later, I was covering a shift at the Allied Museum in Berlin, which actually does focus on post-war history. An American veteran, probably in his 70s, spent 20 minutes lecturing me about our contributions, which was fair, sort of, until he got to the specific part. Without us, you wouldn't have any of these old buildings, he said, gesturing vaguely toward the window, toward the city beyond. We rebuilt every single one. The Brandenburg Gate, those old churches, everything. I nodded politely. The Marshall Plan was certainly important for economic recovery. Not just that, he interrupted. The actual buildings. We brought in architects, construction crews, the whole 9 yards. Brick by brick, we rebuilt Berlin to look exactly like it did before. It took decades. This was a new twist. He wasn't just talking about economic aid. He believed American workers had literally reconstructed every historical building, using old photographs as reference, making replicas so perfect they'd fooled everyone for 70 years. Sir, many buildings were restored by German workers and architects, I said gently, and some, like the Kaiser Wilhelm Memorial Church, were deliberately left partially destroyed as a memorial. He waved that away. Sure, German workers, but American supervision, American money, American know-how. That's the important part. I wondered if he'd feel the same way about the Reichstag, restored by a British architect in the 1990s. Probably not the right time to mention it. The most surreal version came from a college student at a pub in Dresden. She was studying abroad, maybe 20 years old, and had just visited the Frauenkirche. She was telling her friends about it, and I was sitting close enough to overhear. So basically, we destroyed it in the war, felt bad, and then rebuilt it exactly how it was, she explained. That's why it looks so old, but the stones are all clean. It's like our apology gift to Germany. Her friend asked, Wait, American money paid for that? Oh yeah, totally. It's like reparations. We bomb something, we fix it. That's the deal. I almost interrupted to mention that the Frauenkirche was rebuilt primarily with private German donations and started in 1993, decades after any Marshall Plan money. But she was so confident, so sure of this narrative. Where do you even begin? The pattern became clear. In their minds, every ancient stone, every medieval arch, every Baroque facade was somehow an American project. The Marshall Plan had morphed from an economic recovery program into a comprehensive reconstruction fantasy, where American workers rebuilt centuries of European history, brick by brick, to look authentically old. At the Museum Island, I watched an American dad explain to his kids that all these buildings were built in the 1950s using American aid money. His 10-year-old asked why they made them look so old. For tourism, he said confidently. Same reason Disney makes castles. People like old-looking stuff. The kids seemed satisfied with that answer, and that's how it perpetuates. I was working as a taxi driver in Amsterdam when I picked up an American businessman from Schiphol Airport. Early 40s, expensive suit, typing on his phone. We'd barely left the airport area when he looked up and noticed the highway. Nice roads, he commented. When did they repave these? Recently. They maintain them regularly, I said, keeping it simple. Right. But I mean, when were they originally built? With the Marshall Plan money? He said it like he was asking about a shared family project. My dad worked on some of the planning back in the day, engineering stuff. He always said the Dutch roads were built to American specs. I glanced in the rearview mirror. The A4 motorway was built in the 1960s and 70s, I said. Mostly Dutch engineering and funding. He shook his head, still looking at his phone. Nah, it was definitely part of the reconstruction package. American engineers designed the whole highway system over here. I've seen the documents. The confidence was what got me. He wasn't guessing or theorizing. He believed he'd seen actual proof that America designed and built the Dutch highway system. I wondered what documents he meant. Maybe something taken wildly out of context, or completely misunderstood. We drove in silence for a bit. Then he spoke again. You know, you guys should really thank us more often. Like publicly. We literally built this country's infrastructure. I didn't respond. What could I say? The Netherlands has been building roads, canals, and bridges for centuries. We're famous for water management and infrastructure. But in his mind, every highway was an American gift. 2 weeks later, I was working at a bike rental shop near Vondel Park. An American family came in, parents and 2 teenagers. The dad was explaining Amsterdam to his kids while I fitted them with bikes. See, after the war, this whole city was basically rubble, he told them. The Nazis destroyed everything, so America came in and rebuilt it all. That's why it looks so quaint and old-fashioned. They used old pictures to make it look authentic. The mom nodded along. It's like colonial Williamsburg, but bigger. I cleared my throat. Actually, Amsterdam wasn't heavily bombed during the war. Most of the city center is original. Some buildings from the 1600s. The dad gave me a patient smile. I appreciate the tourist narrative, but we know the real history. My uncle was stationed here in '45. He saw the destruction firsthand. I gave them their bikes and a map. The canals they'd cycle past were built in the 17th century. The narrow houses were genuine Golden Age architecture, but they'd ride through the city believing every brick was an American replica from the 1950s. The pattern showed up everywhere. At the train station, I overheard an American student explaining to someone on a video call that European trains only exist because of us. Like, we literally gave them the whole rail system after the war. Before that, they just had horses and carriages. Never mind that the Netherlands' first railway opened in 1839, or that European trains were among the most advanced in the world by the early 1900s. In his version of history, all modern infrastructure was an American invention, generously gifted to a grateful continent. I was at a cafe in Rotterdam when a middle-aged American couple sat next to me. They were discussing the Erasmus Bridge, visible through the window. The woman was reading from a guidebook. It says here it was designed by a Dutch architect in the 1990s, she read aloud. Her husband scoffed. That's just European pride talking. Everyone knows we designed all the major bridges after the war. This one's probably from the 60s, and they just renovated it in the 90s. Should we correct the guidebook? She asked, genuinely concerned about misinformation. Nah, let 'em have it. We don't need the credit. We know what we did. I sipped my coffee and said nothing. The Erasmus Bridge was completed in 1996, designed by Ben van Berkel, and had nothing to do with post-war reconstruction. But they'd returned to America with a story about how their country built it, and Europeans took credit. At the port area, I drove an American logistics consultant to a meeting. He spent the entire ride explaining how Rotterdam's port wouldn't exist without American planning. After the war, it was completely destroyed, he said. We came in, designed the whole layout, brought in the technology, basically created the modern port from scratch. That's why it's so efficient. American engineering. Actually, Rotterdam's port was rebuilt primarily by the Dutch, starting immediately after liberation. Yes, there was international cooperation and some Marshall Plan aid, but the design, planning, and execution were largely Dutch efforts. The port's efficiency came from centuries of Dutch maritime expertise, not a blueprint handed down by Americans, but he seemed so proud, so certain, and honestly, part of me understood it. There's comfort in believing your country was the hero of history, the generous superpower that saved everyone. It's just not quite how it happened. Was working as a tour guide at the Colosseum in Rome when an American woman in her 60s approached me after the group tour ended. She'd been quiet during the presentation, but had that look people get when they're working up to a big question. So, just to clarify, she started. This was built after World War II, right? Like, as a thank you? For liberating Italy? I blinked. Ma'am, the Colosseum was built in 80 AD. It's nearly 2,000 years old. She laughed. That polite laugh people do when they think you're joking. No, honey, I mean the structure we're standing in. I know there was an old Colosseum, but this is the reconstruction, right? The original was destroyed. This is the original, I said slowly. Parts have been restored over the centuries, but this is the actual ancient Roman amphitheater. Her smile faded. She pulled out her phone, typed something, frowned at the results. But my nephew's history teacher said we rebuilt all the important European landmarks after the war. As part of the peace package, I'd heard variations of this before, but never applied to something as ancient and iconic as the Colosseum. The building was already over 1,800 years old when World War II happened, I explained. It was damaged by earthquakes and stone thieves over the centuries, but it survived relatively intact. She looked genuinely distressed, like I'd shattered an important belief. So Americans didn't build this? No, ma'am. Ancient Romans did. She walked away, shaking her head, checking her phone, probably looking for sources that would confirm her original theory. I wondered what that history teacher had actually said, and how it got so thoroughly misinterpreted. The next week, I was covering shifts at a museum in Florence. An American man, maybe in his 40s, spent 15 minutes arguing with my colleague about the Duomo. There's no way that dome is from the Renaissance, he insisted. The engineering is too advanced. It had to be rebuilt with modern techniques, probably in the 50s or 60s. My colleague, bless her patience, tried to explain Brunelleschi's architectural innovations, how the dome was revolutionary for its time, completed in 1436 without traditional wooden scaffolding. Nah, I work in construction back home, he said. That's modern engineering with an old-style facade. Really clever work, but definitely 20th century. Probably American architects consulting. He took photos and left, convinced he'd spotted the truth that everyone else was too polite to mention. The Duomo, one of the greatest architectural achievements of the Renaissance, was secretly an American construction project. I was at the Uffizi Gallery when I overheard a college student explaining Botticelli's Birth of Venus to her friends. So, basically, the original was destroyed in the war, and this is a really good reproduction they made in the 50s. That's why it looks so fresh. Her friend asked if all the paintings were reproductions. Yeah, pretty much, she said confidently. Italy got bombed pretty heavily. The Germans took a lot of art, and what they didn't take got destroyed. So American art historians came over and painted new versions based on photographs and descriptions. I wanted to mention that many artworks were hidden or moved during the war, which is how they survived. The Birth of Venus was actually transported to Villa di Castello for safekeeping, but she was already moving to the next painting, explaining its post-war recreation to her increasingly confused friends. At a cafe near the Ponte Vecchio, I sat next to an American couple arguing about the bridge. The wife was reading her guidebook. It says here it's from 1345. The husband shook his head. That's when the original was built. This is obviously a reconstruction, probably from the 70s, based on the condition. It says it's the only bridge the Germans didn't destroy in World War II, she read. Yeah, and then they rebuilt it exactly how it was. That's the whole point. You're supposed to think it's original. That's good tourism marketing. They went back and forth. The guidebook versus his conviction that nothing old could actually be old. Eventually, they compromised. Maybe it was 60% original with 40% modern reconstruction. Close enough. I met a retired American couple at the train station in Venice. They were discussing St. Mark's Basilica, which they'd just visited. The woman seemed troubled. "I just don't understand why they won't admit it's a replica," she said to her husband. "It's beautiful work, nothing to be ashamed of. But why pretend it's from the year 1000-something? European pride," her husband said simply. "They want to believe they've got ancient history. Let 'em have it." "But it's dishonest," she protested. "Those Byzantine mosaics, obviously made with modern techniques." I could see the electrical lighting behind them. I almost interrupted to explain that yes, modern lighting has been installed to illuminate ancient mosaics. But the mosaics themselves date back to the 11th century. But they were already boarding their train, certain they'd seen through the elaborate historical charade. The wildest conversation happened at a restaurant in Pisa. An American family was having dinner near my table. Dad was explaining the Leaning Tower to his kids. "So, it was built crooked on purpose?" the younger kid asked. No, the dad said. "The original tower started leaning because of bad soil. Then in the war, it got destroyed. So in the 50s, Americans came in to rebuild it, and they thought it'd be funny to make the new one lean too. For tourists," the mom jumped in. "It's actually really smart marketing. Made it famous worldwide." The older kid looked skeptical. "Why would they rebuild a tower just to make it crooked?" "Tourism dollars, buddy. Tourism dollars." I paid my check and left. Sometimes ignorance is too perfect to interrupt. I was working the late shift at a hotel in Budapest when I had my all-time favorite encounter. An American man in his 50s checked in around midnight, exhausted from his flight. As I processed his passport, he looked around the lobby, taking in the Art Nouveau details, the original tile work, the ornate ceiling. "Beautiful renovations," he said, yawning. "When did you guys do all this? Recently?" "The building is from 1896, I said. "Original design by a Hungarian architect. We've maintained it, but it's mostly original." He laughed tiredly. "Come on, man. I'm not a tourist. You can be straight with me. When did Americans fund the rebuild? 50s? 60s? I put down his passport. "Sir, Hungary was under Soviet control after World War II. We didn't receive Marshall Plan funding, and this building predates both world wars." He stared at me, processing. "So, America didn't rebuild Budapest?" "No, sir. At all? Not this building, no." He looked around again, really seeing it this time. The weight of actual history, not the simplified narrative he'd been taught. But I was told we rebuilt everything, all of Europe. "The Marshall Plan helped Western European economies recover," I explained gently. "It was important, definitely, but it wasn't construction work, and it didn't reach Eastern Europe. Most of these old buildings survived wars, time, empires. They were built to last." He stood there in the lobby for a long moment, jet-lagged and confused, his understanding of history shifting slightly. "So this is really from 1896? Really and truly, huh?" He picked up his room key. That's pretty cool." He went to his room, and I went back to my desk. Maybe he'd go home and look things up, learn more, adjust his perspective. Maybe he'd forget the whole conversation by morning. Either way, he'd stayed in a piece of actual history, not a replica funded by his tax dollars. The thing is, I get it. I understand why Americans want to believe they rebuilt Europe. The Marshall Plan was real and important. American aid helped economies recover. There's pride in that. And there should be. But somewhere along the way, economic assistance became literal reconstruction in the popular imagination. Every old building became an American project. Every ancient monument became a 1950s replica. And honestly, it diminishes both sides of the story. It diminishes the actual impact of the Marshall Plan by replacing it with a fantasy. And it erases the incredible achievement of European preservation. The decision to restore rather than replace, to maintain history instead of paving it over. The stories keep coming, though. Just last week, I heard an American tourist explaining to his kids that Big Ben was definitely rebuilt by Americans in the 60s because the original got destroyed in the Blitz. Big Ben is still standing. It survived the war, but in his version of history, every stone in Europe is an American stone, every arch an American arch, every piece of history an American gift. These stories never stop coming, which is exactly why I keep documenting them. Every week, I analyze how myths calcify into certainty, how narratives replace nuance. The people who subscribe aren't here for viral moments. They're here for the long game of understanding how we misremember history. If that's you, subscribe. This work doesn't chase algorithms. It chases patterns,